So I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight for this program on race, gender, and rights, histories of the practice of democratic citizenship. My name is Paul Erickson. I'm the director of the William Clements Library. Before we begin, I want to offer a few quick housekeeping notes. Tonight's program is being recorded to share online. It will be available on the Clements Library website. By this point, many of us are familiar with Zoom, but I wanted to offer just a few tips. If you have comments or questions for the presenters, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, not the chat. My colleagues from the Clements Library will be providing links to relevant information in the chat. We'll also be keeping an eye on the questions. If you would like to view the shared screen, the split screen with the speaker and the slide at the same time, you can go to View Options at the top of your screen and select side-by-side mode. This program is being closed captioned down at the bottom of the screen as part of the University of Michigan's DEI initiative. If you would like to turn that off or make the print larger, you can click on the CC button that says Live Transcript at the bottom of your screen. We are so pleased to welcome 3 distinguished scholars tonight for our first program of the fall 2020 semester and our first online public lecture. We're grateful that Derrick Spires, Martha Jones, and Ben Vinson are all able to be with us tonight. We're also thrilled to be part of the University of Michigan's Democracy and Debate theme semester. This university-wide educational initiative will engage with students, faculty, and staff on an engagement, an exploration of free speech and exchange of ideas, what it means to be a member of a democratic society, and democratic engagement from a global perspective. Tonight's program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. For those of you not familiar with the Clements Library, we are a rare book library and manuscript archive founded in 1923, and there is a picture of our beautiful reading room. Our mission is to preserve, collect, and make available for research and teaching materials related to the history of North America and the Caribbean before 1900. The Clements Library holds manuscripts, rare books and newspapers, graphic arts materials, and one of the finest collections of early American maps in the country. The library is not purely antiquarian in nature. Indeed, one of our core beliefs is that an understanding of our nation's history is essential to a vibrant democratic and civic culture, and that connecting what we know about the past to present questions is part of why the Clements Library exists. This is why we're especially delighted to be co-sponsoring tonight's program with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and their Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship. It's my pleasure to introduce Darshan Gu, Program Director for American Institutions, Society, and the Public Good at the Academy, and the lead staff member on the Commission's work. Darshan?
Thank you, Paul, and thank you so much to the Clements Library for hosting this discussion tonight. The American Academy of Arts and Sciences was founded in 1780 by John Adams and other patriot scholars who recognized the new nation would need an independent source to offer practical policy solutions. In the spring of 2018, the Academy launched the Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship in order to better understand the challenges and opportunities that confront all Americans looking to be active participants in a self-governing community in the 21st century. The 35 members of this commission included individuals from academia, civil society, politics, and business, and from across the ideological spectrum. And this group put aside differences to reach unanimous agreement around a set of important issues that affect all Americans. And we're so grateful that Commission member Ben Vinson will be leading the conversation tonight. The Commission's final report, Our Common Purpose, Reinventing American Democracy for the 21st Century, was released in June of this year. It offers 31 bold recommendations to reinvent American democracy for the 21st century. The recommendations address our political institutions, our civic culture, and our civil society, and seek to create a virtuous cycle between them. And before I hand things back to Paul Erickson, I must acknowledge that until late last year, Paul was the program director at the Academy responsible for this project. And it was because of his leadership and guidance at the Commission, and its final report has been so successful. So many thanks, Paul, for your leadership and for continuing to support this work. And I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Darshan, and the Commission's work could not be in better hands. So tonight's format will go as follows. I will introduce all of our speakers now. Derrick Spires and Martha Jones will each make brief introductory comments about their books, and then we will turn the proceedings over to Ben Vinson. We'll moderate a conversation that will go until about 8 o'clock, and then we will open up the conversation to questions that you have posted in the Q&A. So first, it's my pleasure to introduce Derrick Spires. Professor Spires is Associate Professor of English at Cornell University. He previously taught at Caltech and the University of Illinois. He's published widely on early African American politics, African American intellectual history, and Black print culture. Derrick's first book, The Practice of Citizenship, Black Politics and Print Culture in the Early United States, was published in 2019 and won the St. Louis Mercantile Library Prize from the Bibliographical Society of America in 2020. Our second speaker will be Martha Jones. Professor Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and Professor of History at the Johns Hopkins University, although she formerly taught here at the University of Michigan, where she is deeply missed. She's a legal and cultural historian whose work examines how Black Americans have shaped the history of American democracy. Her most recent books are Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All, published earlier this year, and Birthright Citizens, A History of Race and Rights in Antebellum America, published in 2018, which won the Organization of American Historians Liberty Legacy Award for the best book in civil rights history, and the American Historical Association Littleton Griswold Prize for the best book in American legal history, among other awards. Before embarking on a distinguished academic career, Martha was a civil rights litigator in New York City. She currently serves as co-president of the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians and as a member of the Board of Governors of the Clements Library Associates. The moderator of tonight's conversation will be Ben Vinson III. Professor Vinson is the Provost and Executive Vice President at Case Western Reserve University, where he arrived in 2018 following stints teaching at Barnard College, Penn State, Johns Hopkins, and George Washington University. Ben is an accomplished historian of Latin America and the recipient of the 2019 Howard F. Klein Book Prize in Mexican History for his book, Before Mestizaje, The Frontiers of Race and Caste in Colonial Mexico. Ben is chairman of the board of the National Humanities Center and a member of the board of the National Humanities Alliance, and is a member of the American Academy's Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship. Thanks so much to all of you for being here tonight. And Derrick, I will turn things over to you.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for tuning in on a Monday evening. Thank you. Thanks also to Paul Erickson and the Clements Library and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences for creating this space and occasion to engage with two scholars whose work I admire so deeply. My own work, The Practice of Citizenship, started with a basic question and a few library trips. I wanted to know what was up with all the documents, the convention minutes, addresses, newspaper articles, petitions, and other accounts where Black writers addressed their audiences as fellow citizens. Citizenship talk was ubiquitous in Black print well before the Civil War. A perusal of Dorothy Porter's Touchstone Early Negro Writing, for instance, reveals a collection of addresses on the abolition of the slave trade delivered between 1808 and 1815. And those begin fathers, brethren, and fellow citizens, or simply fellow citizen. Martin Delany dedicates his 1852 immigration pamphlet to the American people, North and South, by their most devout and patriotic fellow citizen, the author. And Frederick Douglass addressed his 1852 oration to fellow citizens, even as he positioned himself outside of the nation. So that was one thing, Dorothy Porter's foundational work. Then, because of the serendipity of library stacks, I saw this pair of red books, Philip Fauner and George Walker's collected proceedings of the Black State Conventions, which provided not just a documentary history of Black activism, but really a collection of legal, philosophical, and literary meditations on what it meant to claim citizenship, even as states like Pennsylvania and New York were becoming more restrictive and hostile towards Black citizens. A little over 175 years ago, for instance, Black Michiganders described the dynamic that I call inverse causality. That's where the mechanisms by which state policy produced the very conditions in Black communities that politicians would then cite as evidence of Black inferiority and cause for further exclusion. The Michiganders, and I hope Michigan people that I'm pronouncing that correctly, I'm from Mississippi, But Michigander said, you have trampled our liberties in the dust, and thus standing with the iron heel of oppression upon our heads, you bid us rise to a level with yourselves. And because we do not rise, you point the finger of scorn and contempt at us and say that we are an inferior race by nature, end quote. At the same time, these documents and the work of initiatives like the Colored Conventions Project help us see how Black women, from Lucy Stanton and Jane P. Merritt to Frances Harper and Marianne Shadd, were insurgently generating a movement both within and without male-dominated collectives. So, my first thought, surely Black writers had no grounds for claiming citizenship before the 14th Amendment. Second thought, wait, what does citizenship mean in general? Because I wasn't clear on that. And for Black writers in particular before the 14th Amendment. I couldn't find an answer that accorded with what I was seeing in this mound of writing, and the more I read, the more my understanding of citizenship, both its limits and possibilities, began to change. At its core then, the practice of citizenship became about the questions and methodologies that emerged when we focus our analysis on the concerns Black writers made foremost and on understandings of these concerns in terms they set forth. In 1840, Samuel Ringo Ward told a white ally who questioned the urgency of his activism, quote, had you a colored skin from October 1817 to June 1840 as I have in this pseudo-republic, you would have seen through a very different medium. What does it mean to see and do citizenship then through a different medium? To the extent that practice of citizenship tells a story, is a story about the tension between Black citizens' creative struggle for a just society, set against an ongoing national predilection to foreclose such possibilities through increasingly restrictive and violent legal and social practices. Black writers argue for more than simple inclusion. Indeed, they argue for the kind of political world in which they would not have to make such an argument. They argue for and actively seek to create a world otherwise. They articulate an expansive practice-based theory of citizenship as a set of common practices, political participation, neighborliness, critique, and revolution, and the myriad daily interactions between people living in the same spaces, both physical and virtual. So I take up these practices, which aren't an exhaustive list, from Absalom Jones and Richard Allen's founding of the Free African Society in 1787, the same year that the federal constitution was ratified, was framed, through Francis E.W. Harper's writing about revolutionary violence on the eve of the Civil War. Throughout, Black citizenship theorizing rejected definitions of citizen based on who a person is or what a white supremacist state disdained to give them, in favor of definitions grounded in the active engagement in the process of creating and maintaining collectivity, whether defined as a state, a community, or other structure. Thinking about citizenship on these terms as practice rather than status allowed me to begin seeing citizenship work happening in recognizable acts, such as voting, alongside less structured acts, such as greeting others on the street. Both acts can signal membership in a political body, and exclusion or refusal can become mechanisms of erasure or identifying those outside the bounds of citizenship. That is, citizenship and the struggles for citizenship happened, or at least I saw them happening, outside of official state institutions in those very spaces Black writers consistently cited as life-sustaining. This work happened as much in the library, the parlor, the kitchen, or the park as it did in the halls of Congress. And it's through these sites that restrictive notions of belonging can be contested and in which alternate models can be theorized and practiced. Thank you.
And now we will turn things over to you, Martha.
So thanks very much, Paul. Thanks to you and the Clements Library. Thanks very much to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I'm really honored to be here with Derrick Spires and Ben Vinson, and I look forward to a really far-ranging conversation. And I am deeply appreciative of the if you will, the broad umbrella for our conversation today, because I'm going to try and talk across two books of mine, along with Derrick's, that have not been in conversation before. So I think that will make for a lively and novel conversation, I hope. And I'm reluctant to summarize the two books, but let me suggest the ways in which I think they each might make some contribution to this conversation. Birthright Citizens was a study that in many ways was developed as a response to among legal historians, a rather pronounced preoccupation with a single US Supreme Court decision, an infamous one, 1857's Dred Scott versus Sanford, in which, as many folks will already know, Chief Justice Roger Brooke Taney concludes that at the founding, no Black American could be a citizen of the United States, be they enslaved or free. And when I say that there was a preoccupation with this case, it's true for many sorts of Supreme Court decisions in the annals of legal history, that we return to them again and again, turn them inside out, upside down, and look to wrench meaning out of them. But my sense was that there was more to the legal history of race and law. Certainly, there was more to the story of Black citizenship, and more, and beyond that, my sense was that perhaps there was a story about the important degrees to which Black Americans were not only students of law, they were agents of law, and they were characters whom jurists like Roger Brooke Taney were intimately familiar with as they penned a series of decisions, edicts, statutes, constitutions, and more over the course of the early 19th century that looked to address and perhaps settle the question of citizenship for Black Americans. Why citizenship? In my story, citizenship looms large in part because long before Chief Justice Taney offers his views on the question in Dred Scott versus Sanford, institutions from Congress to high courts to constitutional conventions to rulings in local courthouses all wrestled with and largely fumbled the question of Black citizenship as a formal matter. And in my story, this is the opening through which Black Americans enter legal culture and begin to develop a theory of citizenship, a view about their indelible belonging, very much in response to the pressures of the colonization movement, which is proposing to remove them from the United States on the one hand, and what we come to term Black laws that regulate their everyday lives in all sorts of quotidian ways. So Black Americans in my story, very much in part through in the same sorts of venues that Derrick Spires visits, begin to articulate a foundation for a theory of American citizenship that is one grounded in birthright. It is the legal principle that Black Americans believe will excuse them from the burdens of colonization and removal, will excuse them from the strictures of Black laws. And it is, in the end, a story about the ways in which from the 1820s forward, Black Americans not only craft this notion, they promote it, they insist upon it. And as we know, by 1868, this vision of US citizenship will not only become law, it will become a signal feature of the 14th Amendment when it is ratified in 1848. And so what was important for me in this book was not only to recover the legal agency of Black Americans, what was also important for me was to discover them literally rather than figuratively, materially rather than abstractly engaged in legal culture. So my principal archive is the archive of a local courthouse, that in Baltimore, Maryland. And from this vantage point, we find African-American men and too few Black women, frankly, picking up this question, wrestling with it, and offering us up a different view of what for a long time for legal historians was a tale about a pernicious Supreme Court decision, ideas that were generated exclusively by jurists like Roger Taney, now becomes a story about the contest between men like Taney and Black Americans who confront him and wrestle with him and men like him over the course of many decades. One of the how can I put it? One of the laments of this book, I'm not sure if lament is the right word, but one of the conclusions that I had to wrestle with was how, with a focus on the legal archive, African-American women very much appeared to fall out of the discussion, that citizenship was not the language and the courthouse was not a venue for Black women by and large. And I'm happy to talk about the exceptions to that. And because I'm someone who has spent a long time and began my career in African-American women's politics, I felt quite accountable to this absence. And that, along with the impending anniversary of the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution, led me to the second book that Paul was so kind to introduce, and that is Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All, which came out just in September of this year. And Vanguard moves away, I think, from the constrained space of citizenship to ask more broadly how African-American women built political power and political rights, with a focus on voting rights across 200 years. So the arc of a story that begins in the earliest decades of the 19th century, not unlike Birthright Citizens, but follows Black women into churches, into political organizations, into literary societies, anti-slavery societies, and a great deal more over 200 years, in part to make the case for the ways in which Black women built a distinct women's movement over the course of 2 centuries, one that largely did not partake of suffrage associations or women's rights associations. And it is a story that starkly reminds us that despite a great deal of fanfare around this year's anniversary of the 19th Amendment for Black American women, for too many Black American women, the 19th Amendment is a milestone, but it is hardly the end of the struggle for voting rights. And that is a story that takes us all the way forward to 1965. In that story, I hear some ideas that I expected to find, and particularly the invocation of equality is one thread of the discourse that Black women produce through struggles around political power and quest for political power and voting rights. And at the same time, as important, it turns out, is the notion of dignity, which is perhaps not an idea or a principle that I had expected to encounter. And then finally, Black women whose sort of underlying purpose in a long struggle for voting rights it grows out of a commitment articulated by best by figures like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper very early in her public career, that principle, which is Black women's politics in the service of all of humanity. And the women I write about are really, I think, founders, certainly when judged by 21st century terms, in the sense that these are women who early on develop a critique of both the role that race and sex play in American politics, the pernicious role of race and sex, of racism and sexism in American politics. And for most of my story, that is the insistence that race and sex should not have a place in American politics is a lonely but central facet of Black women's purpose, of their political vision, and of their intervention in American politics. My students today think that's a very 21st century idea. And so it was fascinating and important to pull the thread on a 21st century set of principles and discover their roots in the early 19th century. I hope tonight I'll discover where these two stories better intersect. I'm actually suspecting that Professor Spires might help me with that, because they certainly are two parallel stories, but two that I have taken on and tried to tell distinctly. And the last thing I'll just put on the table for us, of course, is that I'm so grateful for this opportunity, because I think that the ideas, the practices, the visions, and the aspirations that animate both our studies are those that are profoundly instructive for us in the 21st century. The folks I write about understand politics as a ground game. You have to be in it every cycle, at every turn, and you have to be willing to roll up your sleeves, get in the mud, choose your metaphor, that there's no way to be effective and do politics in the United States without that. And at the same time, I read about people who across a very long time and also across a very lonely road always insist also on their highest ideals, whether it is a principle like birthright citizenship, or it is a political culture that is devoid of both racism and sexism. The Black Americans I write about hold a lofty set of ideals and look to the rest of the nation to catch up. And the last bit is about the long game that the folks I write about, many of them never live lives long enough to see the realization of many of the goals that they have, whether it's the ratification of the 14th Amendment or the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And yet I think that all our stories are stories about commitments across generations. It is about generations of folks who till soil and plant seeds and leave us to do the good work of democracy in our own time. I can't imagine a better moment in our own lifetimes to be talking about these questions. And so I thank you all very much for having me, and I very much look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Derrick and Martha, for what I realize is a whirlwind tour through some incredibly rich and nuanced scholarship. And so I encourage everybody who's watching to buy these books and read them. They are, all three of them, spectacular. And now I will turn things over to Ben Vinson to lead our conversation. Ben?
Thank you so much. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here with all of you. And just hearing both of you talk, Derrick and Martha, I believe that what you are, the works you have produced are absolutely essential. And the stories you resurrect, the narratives you uncover right now really touch a chord and strike a chord with the heart of who we are, and also the work of the Commission, which has really set course to try to restore our democracy and to renew our sense of civic faith. So in an effort to really try to put your books into conversation with one another, I'm going to try to begin, first of all, by noting that both of your books, they highlight that until the passage of the 14th Amendment, there was no clear definition of what a U.S. citizen was. And each of you propose a definition of citizenship that extends beyond legal status to incorporate a broader ethical conception of community engagement and collective practice. Now, Derrick, your work focuses on figures in Black print culture. You're talking about newspaper editors, clergymen, participants in state conventions. Martha, Your work focuses on, in the case of, at least in the case of Birthright Citizens, on Black residents in Baltimore, sailors, ministers, travelers, and in Vanguard, as you've noted, on Black women who were leaders in the Black church, political activists, poets. In all of these cases, these people understood that citizenship or the vote were important, but they weren't the final destination. Can you share with this audience tonight how the people you write about defined citizenship and explain why it was important to think about citizenship as more than just legal status? Maybe this is a common point of starting.
Well, I can jump in if that's okay with Professor Spires and start. I mean, I guess part of what I want to say is that I'm not so quick to abandon the claim that Black Americans weren't thinking about law. In my work, I think they were thinking a great deal about it. And one of the things that perhaps surprised me early on in my work is how much law, the courthouse, the Constitution, the Declaration, and more really mattered to Black Americans. They were not only students of it, I discovered them engaged with people like Chief Justice Taney, like Attorney General William Wirt, and many other sort of folks who we more readily associate with legal thought, legal practice. These are folks that Black Americans seek out as they are wrestling with this question. But I think what's spot on, Ben, in your comments is that Black Americans live under a troubling shroud of uncertainty until the 14th Amendment, certainly. That is to say, in my story, ask the US Supreme Court on Tuesday and then ask the Maryland Court of Appeals on Thursday, and you'll get two very different answers about where Black Americans stand before the Constitution, before the law as citizens. And that it is that kind of uncertainty, it is that kind of unsettledness that I should say resonates with our own time when so many Americans live under the shroud of uncertainty with respect to their belonging. But for the folks we write about in the 19th century, it certainly doesn't require folks I write about to be profoundly creative about ideas of citizenship and also profoundly insistent. And so that is not a formula that guarantees success at all. It will take, it's important to remember, it takes civil war in the United States to give us the 14th Amendment, among other things. But it is the route, right, to a persistent banging on the door, a persistent claim to belonging, even in the face of an officialdom that is prepared to not only doubt Black belonging, but is prepared to fumble it at nearly every turn.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And my version of this is, what does it mean to be a citizen before the 14th Amendment depends on where and when. You could travel from New York to Pennsylvania to Ohio and go through three very different regimes, especially if you're a Black American. And I think for me, these extra legal understandings of citizenship, at least in some cases, emerge because we're dealing with Black activists and writers who, in Pennsylvania, for instance, in 1836, could theoretically legally vote. Like, we could talk about the barriers they would have to face in order to get there, the violence they could face, et cetera, but they could legally vote. 1837, 38, Pennsylvania has a state constitutional convention and they restrict voting rights to white men. Look at the New York context. New York has their state constitutional convention and they remove restrictions on white men, but maintain a $250 property requirement for Black men. And in both cases, these are people who Like 1 year begin in one place with at least some form of stability, some sense of being a citizen, and suddenly they have one of those pillars removed. And that forces them to begin to sort of peel back some of the layers. Okay, if our belief that we are citizens and our claims, our legal claims, our social political claims haven't changed, and yet our access to some rights have changed, on what basis can we think of ourselves as citizens? And in the New Yorker's case, for instance, that leads to their articulation of a natural rights, birthright citizenship, that leads to their sort of peeling back the layers of what the state does in relation to citizenship. So if we can't formally vote, that doesn't mean that we aren't still engaged in political participation. Let us show you how many ways, right? We're paying taxes, we're going to schools, our conventions themselves are our attempts to engage in the democratic process. And whether or not the state recognizes that in this moment, that's still doing the work of citizenship. And even this is the push-pull of it, even as they're articulating all the ways that they see themselves as citizens, despite states taking away the rights associated with citizenship, they're still engaging with the state. So conventions of the early 1840s, Henry Highland Garnett and others, they're doing petition drives. They're taking those petitions to the state houses in Albany. They're meeting with legislators. They're meeting in committees. They're doing all of this engagement. In the Pennsylvania context, one of my favorite stories, it did not succeed. And I think that happens with a lot of my favorite pre-Civil War stories. But a collective of folks in Pittsburgh develop statistical data on Black Pittsburgh, tax paying, histories of voting, property ownership, all the sort of collective data to demonstrate that they are indeed constructive citizens living out the nation's democratic ideals. They package that into a memorial and they send it to the state constitutional convention. And if you read, and we know this because it's in the Pennsylvania State Constitutional Convention minutes, where they have pages of debates, not just about the merits of what these Pittsburgh activists are saying, but on whether or not they even have standing to say it. Like one delegate says, you call this a memorial, so that doesn't mean we have to take it as a petition, right? Since you called it a memorial. Another delegate says, well, citizens don't petition, they demand. And so you can see them sort of on the Black activist side, taking all the ways that states and local governments try to take away the rights associated with citizenship, try to take away the characteristics of citizenship. And their adjustment is to peel back the layers to think about, okay, voting, what does that actually accomplish, right? Schools, what do they actually accomplish? Travel, what does that actually accomplish? And they articulate that again and again and again.
Let me ask you guys both a question, because what I'm hearing here is interesting. Okay, so you got some people are legally disenfranchised. You're talking about a very spotty citizenship. You're talking about people who are articulating goals in one sense, and that's contingent upon a whole host of things. What does that mean for political power in the 19th century? Was that even possible? I mean, what does the 19th century tell us about African American political power?
Spotty is the word, I think. Spotty is the word. And if you ask Black Pennsylvanians, they saw the restricting of voting rights as a recognition of that political power, in the form of voting, but also in the form of coalitions that might have been. In 5 Points, New York, you have developing coalitions among working classes across races, among Irish immigrants, Black New Yorkers, et cetera. That is a form of power that's percolating. And city policy, housing policy, et cetera, disrupt that. So there are these moments, these spotty moments, where you can see political power sort of coalescing only to sort of get disrupted. But the energy never goes away completely. It just sort of shifts and moves and continues to build. But my sense is that it's still spotty and that it always requires allies. This is the other thing we learn about Black politics. It always requires allies. This is the case with the American Anti-Slavery Society, right? They actually learn from Black activists, James Wharton, Mariah Stewart, David Walker, how to think about anti-slavery. And without those Black activists sort of doing the teaching, we don't get necessarily the American Anti-Slavery Society. I wish I had a more satisfactory answer. And since I don't, I'm gonna pass the mic to Professor Jones.
Well, thank you for that. I guess the first thing to say is that one of my reflections about the long history of my first reflection about the long history of voter suppression and the disenfranchisement of Black Americans, as Professor Spires points to in New York and Pennsylvania in the antebellum period, among other places. I guess the first thing to say is I don't associate voting rights with citizenship in the early 19th century. Many non-citizens are eligible to vote. But I do think that voting rights, or the suppression thereof, is a confession about the fear of the power of Black politics to disrupt or to upend or to unsettle a perceived balance of power, especially between political parties. This is true in the decades before the Civil War. The suppression of Black votes is not a purely raw expression of anti-Black animus, though that is very much present. The suppression of Black votes in New York and Pennsylvania is also about party politics and about the suppressing the influence of Black Americans at the polls in local and state level contests, where not only their votes, but their votes cast as a block really threaten to destabilize or to decenter the balance of power as it exists. By the time we get to the 20th century, and African American women now are going to come to their opportunity to vote by way of the 19th Amendment, the precise same equation is being worked through by the 20th century by the Democratic Party, which has built its power nationally on the disenfranchisement of African American men. Yes, animated by white supremacy, but also mobilized more strategically and with more precision to maintain control of politics, state, local, and national. And when Black women are disenfranchised, which too many of them are across the American South, the debates are, yes, those that mobilize anti-Black racist ideas, but they do so very much in service of political parties. And so that fear, that suppression, I think tells us a great deal about the possibility and the threat of Black political power going back to the 1820s and 30s. But that is a story that continues all the way into the 20th century.
Yeah, just to add to that, Pennsylvanians called race-based suffrage restrictions a passport to power. Mm. And they warned their fellow white citizens that they're doing it to us right now, but they'll come for you when it serves them.
So if you don't mind, let me, these are intriguing reflections. I'd like to take this analysis a little bit more into the present state for just a moment, because I'd love to understand from both of your perspectives, what does this troubled, alliance-filled, spotty struggle in history actually mean for us in this more contemporary period. And now let me just sketch this out a little bit, because the commission's report, Our Common Purpose, basically has a couple of claims. It at the outset, it claims that the United States underwent a second founding with the end of slavery, and then a third founding during the civil rights movement, and that we now need a fourth founding, a reinvention of some basic cultural and institutional building blocks of our democracy. So when we think about that, at least that claim in the report, and we think about the lineage that you've started to trace, which is really one of difficulty and struggle, what's the connection here, and to what extent can we be more successful in this founding when it's predicated upon this troubled journey? I'm not sure if I'm clear.
I mean, I think what you're asking is important. And from my vantage point, what I can tell you is I think that the claim of a second founding is difficult to sustain, though I'm drawn to it, as you might expect, which is to say that what the Civil War and Reconstruction accomplish is the abolition of slavery, not the abolition of anti-Black racism. It is not the expungement of the kind of the vision, the insistence of the colonizationist view going back to the 18th century, right? Which is that the US, whatever it's going to be a white man's republic. And I just don't think there is enough, there is enough structurally perhaps in Reconstruction, but there is not enough in the ways in which Reconstruction plays out to push back or eradicate that. And so fast forward to the 21st century, not that easy to do, but I'll try, which is to say that part of why we sit here and we are witness to, we are victims of, we are the targets of voter suppression in the 21st century is that voter suppression never left. It never went away. And the racialized underpinnings of voter suppression have never been eradicated in this country, that every generation has struggled openly and notoriously over, for example, voting rights. If there's a golden age, it might be between 1965 and the Voting Rights Act and 2013 and the gutting of the Voting Rights Act by the US Supreme Court. But absent that, I think that the story in American politics is a story of voter suppression and the ways in which racial animus is oftentimes the instrument, the tool, the technology that gives us and that gives license to voter suppression. But I haven't read your report, Ben, so I feel a little like I should just qualify and say, I look forward to reading the report, and I'm sure I will learn something from it. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And Professor Spires, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything.
Aside from amen, because I agree with everything Professor Jones has said. I'm reminded of a bit from Francis Harper's Mini Sacrifice, which was serialized in the Christian Recorder over 1869-70. So as Reconstruction is happening, and one of the things Minnie says as she's watching the Civil Rights Acts, the amendments, all this unfold, as she's sort of in the South watching communities rebuild, she says, like, I wish we weren't doing this piecemeal. Like, if we're gonna redo this, if we're gonna rebuild a nation, we have to sort of build it up from the foundation, because the foundation itself is premised on the very things Professor Jones talked about, the voter suppression, the notion that this country belongs to a particular set of people. It is a white republic and everyone else is here under sufferance. And so whatever founding ideals, there are ideals that many of us can quote and cite, and can claim as ours, but it's never really treated as things we have a right to.
Given hearing both of your answers to that question, I want to stay kind of in the relative present for a moment, or actually in the very present for the moment. And I want to ask you now specifically about the protests that over police violence and racial injustice that have occurred this summer. And given what you've seen and what you've studied and how you've cataloged this important history, was there anything about this movement and this moment in American history right now that struck you as unique? Are there continuities in Black political activism that you see being carried over from the 19th century into today? I want to understand a little bit more how you see from those lessons of the past. How does that help you understand the moment?
Well, there's one facet of this moment that is for many Americans unthinkable. And that is that this movement was built by Black women. And the moment of the 19th Amendment is one in which the notion that Black women can exercise national, outsized, consequential political power and political leadership and political power is precisely what the flaccid terms of the 19th Amendment are intended to prevent. And in that sense, I don't think that 100 years ago, no one other than Black women themselves anticipated precisely where we'd be with not only Black women who have built this movement for Black lives, but those women alongside the women whose names appear on our ballots. Back in June here in Baltimore, where I live, we had a primary contest. And it was in that moment when, on the one hand, each evening, Baltimoreans, including Black Baltimoreans, gathered at City Hall to rise up and to protest. And on that election Tuesday, in the first week of June, Black Baltimoreans, those who didn't get those ballots or didn't have a confidence in voting by mail, showed up to polling places and cast their ballots. And for me, it was a crystallizing moment to recognize that all of that is part of a shared political culture, that these aren't mutually exclusive. But 100 years ago, the outsized role that Black women would be playing as voters and as candidates and as leaders of social movements is something that very few Americans could have admitted or admired or allowed for in their imaginations.
Yeah, and I think part of what shifted too is the decentralization of the media infrastructure. So one of the things we can plot, especially in terms of so women in politics, it's say the founding of the Provincial Freemen by Mary Ann Shadd Cary as a space where Black women have a voice and ownership over the venue. Ida B. Wells, Pauline Hopkins, and others. You spin that forward though, and what shifts is Black women doing a lot of work that's not getting recognized and not having space to be in leadership positions. Now we're in a moment where the ability to communicate and organize isn't as dependent on these kind of institutional forms. That along with the cultural shifts that Professor Jones was talking about. And so that is like startlingly new. And at the same time, as Professor Jones said, when you think about Black women's politics, not completely unexpected. I also think, like when you ask a question about what's unique, I am trained in the English department, but like when Nafisa and I talk, my partner and I talk, she jokes that I'm always going to have an anecdote from the 1850s or the 1790s, because there is a bit of like, the changing same, a bit of repetition with the difference. And so you find a similar, like the activism that's happening on all forms of media and all forms of public places is getting met with a similar sort of backlash that we see happening with, say, the publication of Walker's Appeal. And I think one of the differences now, hopefully, is that there's such a critical mass of people who are active and working and in communication over so many different places that it's going to be much more difficult to put a lid on. That is my hope, at least.
Well, both of you are offering some penetrating insights, and they're drawn obviously from rich historical study. I believe that we're approaching almost the end of my time before we open it up to questions. But let me linger on this because I'm going to try to tie in everything we've been talking about along with the commission's report and leave with one simple question as we march towards November. And one of the things you're doing is kind of restoring a particular history. It's in dialogue with a traditional history, and in some ways, one has to acknowledge what work do you do to change kind of the narrative. As we ponder your interventions, one of the things the commission is trying to also do is to think about the road that we've traveled collectively and to really chart a forward moving path towards a more representative democracy, one that addresses many of the problems of the moment, and that finally addresses long-standing racial inequities. What do you think, given what you've studied and how you've come to analyze our history, what do you think can be done at this moment to forge a more representative democracy? And obviously we're in an election year, and you also you've studied deeply what citizenship itself means. So thinking about all of that in this stew, how do you think we can move ahead towards forging a more representative democracy that addresses these long-standing inequities? And after that, I think I'm going to have to turn it back over to Paul. I could talk with you, trust me, all evening, but I will not have that luxury.
Well, I'll jump in and say that, and I'll confess. I've proposed two things for what it's worth, and I've done it in print. So this isn't news. But the first is I've written about the necessity for a constitutional amendment that guarantees the right to vote to all Americans. Right now, our voting rights regime operates by way of a U.S. Constitution that guarantees to no American the right to vote, and simply places curbs on what states cannot do, on what states can do. And I think we need an affirmative right to vote that shifts the burden from citizens to the state, such that the obligation lies with the state to ensure that we possess ballots so that we have the opportunity to cast them, that those ballots are then counted. So this is one sort of, if you ask me what I would do, that is, I think, an important and maybe essential piece of sort of resetting the American project when it comes to voting rights, when it comes to political rights. And once I'd accomplished that, I would return to the 19th century to remind us that there was a time when in many states, citizenship was not a prerequisite for voting rights, and that we live in a country where there are many Americans who are not citizens of the United States, who nonetheless have a long-term stake in this nation, have helped to build it, to sustain it more. And the individual states, even without a constitutional amendment, remain at liberty to empower non-citizens to vote. There are places in this country in local elections where non-citizens do indeed vote. And this, I think, would go a tremendous way to resetting the equation profoundly when it comes to not simply voting rights as voting rights, but how do you build a body politic? How do you rebuild a body politic? How do you create a body politic in which many more Americans, rather than too few Americans, understand their relationship to it, see their role within it, and are moved and motivated to participate in it, yes, on election day, but really on every day. I don't think our democracy, or I think the best chance for our democracy is in expanding our democracy rather than continuing to narrow it, which is the path that we're on today.
Yeah, and I would agree with both of those things and co-sign for what my co-signature is worth. And on the kind of social cultural end, need to come to terms with the notion that this isn't a zero-sum game, wherein a universal sort of constitutional amendment guaranteeing the right to vote doesn't mean people lose something. Allowing non-citizens to vote doesn't mean we lose something, we actually gain from that. And I think we as a country have to have a reckoning with how race and sex power has worked. Have an honest reckoning with that involves economic repair, because it's very difficult. It will be, I'm just struck by one of Professor Jones's chapters on the Seneca Convention, who could go there because maybe they didn't have to work that day, who has the bandwidth to do work because they're in, like we are professors at a university, we're sort of subsidized in that way to do some of this work. So a fundamental economic equality is required too.
Thank you so much, Ben and Derrick and Martha. And I will turn it over to my colleague, Angela Unk, our Director of Development, who is monitoring the Q&A. Angela, are there questions that have come in from the audience?
Hi. Yes, there are. Thank you so much to all three of you for your wonderful insights tonight and for starting this conversation off and inspiring us to think more about it. Yes, we have a lot of questions already. So I think I'll start with Cheryl's question, because she was listening very carefully and is wondering, to what extent were there actual examples of Black, she's assuming male, voters prior to the Civil War? Which states had more examples, and were there property requirements that made it possible?
So yeah, there are a good number of examples. New York, Frederick Douglass voted because he met the $250 property requirement. Rhode Island is an interesting case because one of the stratagems to reconcile a constitutional crisis in the state was to grant Black men the right to vote. And that voting bloc helped cement sort of the coalition that kept Rhode Island whole, right, in the 1840s. One of the preludes to Pennsylvania revising its own constitution was a court case in which a Black man tried to vote and sued. So there were any number of examples of Black people, both individual and collective examples of Black voting.
And I'll just add, in Maryland, African-American men vote until the early 19th century, when the word white is, the qualification white is inserted into the state constitution.
Thank you. So Amy is asking a question of Professor Spires. How does rhetorical militancy intertwine into your concept of the dialectic dialogic model?
So I'm gonna take that as a chance to just talk about rhetoric in general, because what we find among Black activists of all sorts is that they're sort of master manipulators of rhetoric and public media. One of the strongest examples is David Walker's appeal, appears in 1829 to the colored citizens of the world, where he essentially takes Thomas Jefferson and the rest of the nation to task and sort of says in caps locks with 6, 7, 8 exclamation points, read your own declaration. And he says this nation is as much ours as yours, in part because Black blood has watered the soil in the form of enslaved labor. And that sort of, that work, that document had such an effect. It started in Boston and circulated as far south as Florida, and within the years, states like South Carolina, Georgia, and others had started passing anti-literacy laws, had started restricting the movement of Black sailors so that Massachusetts would then sue Georgia, if I'm remembering the history correctly about it, and claiming Black sailors from Massachusetts as citizens of Massachusetts. So there's a sense that sometimes militancy in the rhetoric could very well press sort of states and other political bodies to do things and make claims that they may not have otherwise. And then you'd have someone like Frederick Douglass or Francis Harper, especially Francis Harper, who was sort of a master of tone and stance and rhythm and sort of presentation. And I see Professor Jones nodding, so I kind of want to just pass it over to you to talk about Harper, because she knew how to navigate a space and deliver a message, especially in many of her speeches to white women, to tell people things they didn't want to hear, but in ways that they couldn't shun her because they did it. She did it in such a way that caught them off guard often, I think. But I hope that gets to the question.
I won't say too much, except I can't resist any opportunity to speak about Francis Harper, because I share your sense of this. And at the same time, I think that we've often ourselves as scholars misread her or underconsidered her sort of the strength and it's not only the strength, it's the bite of her words, because she couches it in a way. She's very much to me like Mary Church Terrell in the early 20th century. You know, Terrell, the suffragist, president of the National Association of Colored Women, and much more. You know, Terrell too had a remarkable appetite for speaking to all sorts of mixed audiences, and had this capacity to persuade people to ways of thinking that they didn't even know they were being asked to adopt. And it is, I think it's a bodily sartorial presence mixed with a style of rhetoric that's very powerful. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Rex is asking, to what extent does the suppression of history, and in parentheses, our overall national ignorance of Walker's appeal, for example, or the Vesey conspiracy, have, as a consequence, the suppression of power held by African Americans for their representation? If we, in other words, we being the mainstream of America, could face the dire situations of humanity writ large and conceive of them as our own, perhaps we would breathe new life into our original ideas of independence from a colonizer and a representation.
I really like this question, so thank you very much for it. Because it's one I pose to my students, but to colleagues as well, which is once we get beyond sort of, adages and truisms about history, what power, if any, do we think historical understanding has? And I can't speak, I don't think, very insightfully to mainstream America. But I'll share a perspective that comes out of my sensibility as a Black American about the ways in which I think part of what history offers to us is beyond its facts and figures, is it is a factor in our imaginations, right? It is a factor that shapes our imaginations, our sense of the possible. And I'll tell a very short anecdote that isn't really mine, but it's one that is important. It helped me to appreciate this. And it comes from a television show, which is called Finding Your Roots, and which is hosted by Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. And maybe you've seen the show, or at least you've read about it. Gates invites celebrities to come on the program, and his team does their family histories. And then he reveals them with great drama, and there's always a moment. I like it a lot, but that's beside the point. There's an episode in which Chris Rock, the comedian, is in the hot seat, and Gates opens the book and begins to narrate the history of Rock's family, much of which Rock does not know. And finally, he gets to the moment where he reveals to Chris Rock that one of his forebears, perhaps it's a great grandfather, had been an important Black activist during Reconstruction and had been in politics and in the ways that we know thousands of Black men and some women were in those extraordinary years of a brief interracial democracy. And you can see Chris Rock's countenance shift. And he says to Gates, my father was a janitor in New York. And with no disrespect to my father, all I imagined for my life was that I would be a janitor like him, except that I found comedy, right? And comedy leads me down a different path, and here I sit. He said, but imagine if I had known all along that my great-grandfather had been a political activist, a leader in Reconstruction during this extraordinary moment in history. And it's a very moving moment. You can see that Rock is moved. And I believed him in the sense that I believed that somebody had opened a door, turned on a light, and shown him a past that he believed could have changed his present and his future. So I think for Black Americans and the people for whom I write, principally, it is partly history as part of what shapes our sense of the possible, shapes our imaginations, shapes our dreams and our visions. We still have to do the work in our own time to get there, of course, but we need to have that sense of that future that we can't quite see, but that we know is there, that is not this.
Thank you. We have a question wondering if the debates over Black citizenship in the United States in the 19th century were unique compared to debates in other countries.
My first response is to plead that I'm not an expert outside of the US. I'm sitting on a panel with someone who is. My
Hardly.
second response would be to say it depends. If by other countries you mean Haiti, then that's not really a debate. That's baked into its constitution. If by other countries you mean United Kingdom or France, then the answer is it's as vexed and ongoing, maybe with different details here and there.
Yeah, I think this is an important facet of how Black Americans, at least the folks I write about, are grappling with citizenship, is that they do think about it comparatively. And they understand, for example, that throughout the Americas, whether, for example, Gran Colombia, Haiti, but also in West Africa and Liberia, these are places where of course, the history will be more complex than the promise, but where there is a promise of a sort of full, thoroughgoing citizenship that includes political rights, that draws Black Americans away from the US to the Caribbean, to West Africa, and they measure the paucity of their own experience of citizenship in the US against sometimes distant, but nonetheless important sensibilities about what citizenship is and how it works in other places.
Thank you. Thanks. I know that we have a lot of avid readers who are part of our audience, and I had a question emailed to me before we even started the program tonight, just wondering if you have any comments about how your work might how you might feel about the writings of Shelby Steele. That's it. I know that it's a.
I was going to punt that to the
I know.
Professor of Literature, but I'm not a reader of Shelby Steele.
I would say the same.
Okay, I wasn't sure, and I thought, well, it seemed like a question worth throwing out there. Comparing apples and oranges a bit. So, but thank you, and thank you to Doug for asking it. And perhaps we'll finish up with Stefan's question about, he's saying that his question builds a bit on Professor Vinson's comments. I hear really good things from both presenters pertaining to citizenship as a site of contestation, community, and resistance. But I'm wondering about how racial terror figures into the contorted forms of freedom and citizenship, which were evolving from right before the Civil War into emancipation and beyond. What would this relationship between citizenship, white supremacist terrorism, and power mean for sustaining Black citizenship going forward?
I can answer that from the perspective of the women of Vanguard, who really from the 1850s forward are profoundly forthcoming about the scourge of sexual violence in their lives, whether it's in the context of work, it's in the context of politics, it's in the context of travel, and more. African American women contend with sexual violence, contend with the threat of sexual violence, and look to infuse women's rights and women's suffrage politics with that concern. They understand voting rights to be perhaps an avenue toward challenging and curbing sexual violence as it plagues their lives. And so, yes, the answer is that there isn't really a moment in the story that I tell that it isn't inflected by terroristic violence in the form of sexual assault.
And it's the same in the stories I tell on scales small and large. One of the frameworks that I turn to these days comes from Caretha Mitchell. Her book is from this, I can't remember what comes before the colon.
From the slave cabin to
the White House.
Yeah.
Does something come before the colon? It's gotta be. No, it doesn't. It's
No, I don't
homemade
think so.
citizenship. Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, but one of the terms she uses is know your place aggression, and one of her arguments is, and this is a pattern you see across both my work and Professor Jones's work, especially in Vanguard, is that on scales large, great and small, as Black people, people of color, Black women assert themselves in the public space, whether it's law, it's culture, whether it's dressing nicely and going out to dinner to have fun, do that too much and it's met with racial violence. On larger scales, you see across history, both recently, I've been getting emails about students here who live downtown Ithaca, this kind of, college town liberal bastion, who are being sort of terrorized, might be too strong of a word, but I imagine for them it's not too strong of a word, just existing in the space in this political moment. In the 19th century, you have parades celebrating British emancipation being met with entire sections of town getting burned down. And often Black people don't have to be doing anything except existing in a space to be met with the violence. So this is one of we would talk about what we need to do in order to come to a sort of sense of democratic equity. It's one of the things we have to deal with. And by we, it's not me necessarily, it's not thinking about two speeches. Frederick Douglass and Harper both gave speeches about the great problem to be solved. And Douglass, in one version of his speech, Douglass broke and just said, look, it's not my problem. It is like white Americans who are terrorizing me and my people. This is not my problem. There's no Negro problem.
So before we conclude, I want to abuse my prerogative and ask one last question of both of you. So the practice of engaged citizenship is in many ways an act of faith, sort of a sense of optimism that things can get better and that ordinary people can affect political change. And as part of the Commission's work, we held over 50 listening sessions around the country with Americans of all political persuasions, all walks of life, and found that so many people are distrustful of our institutions and frustrated with our political system, not facing anything like the obstacles that you both just talked about in terms of resistance. So how did the Black activists that you write about persist in the face of ongoing white resistance and terror to the prospect of Black enfranchisement and Black political power? What gave them optimism to continue their work?
I want to jump in because I prefer Professor Jones to have the last word. But also, as a literary critic, what I find in Black newspapers is a lot of humor and fun. Like literature, spirituality were all places where people, like, they lived lives and they found ways large and small, to find sustenance in community. It's one thing. Second thing, they were constantly working. And I get the sense from reading these writers and activists that they didn't slow down enough to doubt. And when they did, that pause often led them to creative solutions. Martin Delaney, for instance, to shift from the United States context to a different context, be it Central Africa, Nicaragua, Haiti, Marianne Shad, shift to a different context. Canada, we've been talking about US citizenship, but for some folks, there were better options. And so creativity kept people going. Art kept people going. Poetry is not a luxury. And the work kept them going. Like, faith without works is dead. And so they weren't sort of sitting back in a kind of passive faith. They worked.
Thank you for that. I think we also have to confess that not everyone keeps going. To imagine that there is no blood on the page is to, I think, unfortunately, allied. Francoise Hamlin, the historian at Brown University, has just recently published an article about Anne Moody, whose civil rights era memoir is widely read and taught today. But Hamlin was among the very first to follow Moody out of the student sit-in scene, out of the American South into the rest of her life. And I commend the article to everyone to discover what a difficult, troubled life Anne Moody led in the wake of her courageous, belief-filled, righteous activism in the modern civil rights era. So I don't think we all survive. I think it's important to say. But I do like Stacey Abrams, and I'm going to paraphrase her here. I hope I get it mostly right, who says, I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic, right? I'm too busy being engaged. I'm too busy being determined. And I take that to be an extension of the sense that perhaps, as Professor Spires has said, that there's very little room for anything other than going forward in any case. What other choice would Black Americans have, if I could put it that way, except to persevere, to persist, and more, it would be to fold, it would be to collapse, it would be to concede, it would be to be overrun by the force and the fantasy and more of white supremacy. And so I take Abrams to be saying that's not really an option for her. Maybe that's not an option for many of us. And the last bit is, frankly, I call the Black women I write about in this most recent book the Vanguard, because actually the way they persist is that they know they're right. They know they're right. They have strong ideas and they know they're correct. And yes, there is everything about this country that would try and persuade them otherwise, and to insist that it was correct, in fact, to trade in anti-Black racism, to trade in sexism, to trade in the intersection of those things. And the women I write about know that they are right. And that's how they persist. And it turns out they are, because here we sit in the 21st century and think their ideals are axioms, when in fact they were very hard fought for principles.
On that note, I want to thank our presenters tonight, Martha Jones, Derrick Spires, Ben Vinson. Thank you so much, Darshan Gu. Thank you, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Angela, thank you and your team. I want to encourage everybody who joined us tonight to come back a week from tonight for our next fall program on our calendar. Rick Bell of the University of Maryland will be talking about his book Stolen, which is a fantastic book, 5 free boys kidnapped into slavery and their astonishing odyssey home. And then on November 7th, Allison Lang will be talking about the visual culture of the women's suffrage movement. So please be sure to join us for those 2 programs. And again, thank you so much to our participants tonight and to all of you for attending. Have a great evening. Bye-bye, everybody.